My name is Donna Hicks, and I've been a international conflict resolution specialist for about 25 years. I've worked out of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard, and I discovered over the years that I'd been working with parties in conflict in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, Northern Ireland, wherever there was a hot conflict, my organization usually was there to try to bring the parties together for dialogues. And one of the things that I found after all those years of working with these parties was that there was something missing in our understanding of how to resolve these conflicts. And to me, it was a huge piece, and I didn't know how to talk about it. And that missing piece, I'm just going to fast forward just so we can get to the heart of the matter and link it to coaching. That missing piece is people's desire to be treated with dignity. And in these conflicts, that was the first thing to go. People, when you feel threatened and communities decide to take up arms against each other, believe me, the first thing to go really is empathy for the other, and the second thing to go is treating the person as if he or she or that community or that identity group as if they're human beings. And when I was sitting at these tables, I could see that happening. I could see how people were so outraged by the way they were being treated, but nobody ever talked about it. All we ever talked about were the political issues. So I'm sitting there as a psychologist, trained as a psychologist, even though it was a political psychologist. I sat there and I said, we have to get this issue on the table. Instead of talking about politics and borders and who's going to be sharing power, we need to talk about the way people are being treated. And so I came up with this idea that because people don't like to talk about being traumatized. People don't like to be labeled emotionally wounded. But then one day I came up with this concept and I said, what if we use the language of dignity to bring these issues to the surface? Because if I were to say to somebody, tell me about a time when you were emotionally wounded, they would shut down. They wouldn't say a word, especially these high-level leaders with whom we were working. But if I said to them, okay, tell me about a time when you felt that your dignity had been violated. And I swear to you, what happened was the floodgates opened. Not only would they be willing to tell stories about their dignity violations, but they brought all the stories from their families, from their ancestors. So I felt like I struck gold here in using this word.
Issue.
It's a baseline. And here's the thing. The thing is, Joan, that no matter where I was, no matter what table I was sitting at, whether it was the Middle East, Asia, Africa, right here in the United States, no matter what table I was sitting at, the people reacted in exactly the same way. So again, I felt like I struck gold. Dignity is the way that we can talk about these emotional issues, not unlike what Dan Goldman is talking about today, too. How do we get people to understand the impact of their actions on one another? How do we get people to understand how important that this dignity concept is? When I do interventions with people, when I bring them together, I say, look, you can't dig down any deeper than dignity. It's as far as you can go in the human experience. So my work here, applying it here in the coaching arena, having seen the connection between the universality of this dignity stuff, it doesn't matter where in the world you go. I realize that wherever people congregate and there's conflict, think about the workplace, think about your relationships, your significant relationships, think about schools, think about healthcare. I mean, all of a sudden, everybody's interested in this issue of dignity. I wrote a book entitled Dignity. Its essential role in resolving conflict. It's out there, and ever since the book was published a couple of years ago, I've been going around to hospitals, to the corporate world. I did a 5-year intervention in American Airlines, in education, in the clergy even. So I realized that this is really what I'm focusing on with this Dignity Project, is trying to get people who are in leadership positions to understand the importance of this concept of dignity in the way they treat them, in the way they treat their direct reports, and for the coaching profession to have this lens to use to ask questions and to get deeper into what the needs are of their clients, whether they're working with leaders or whether they're working with the direct reports of the leaders. Everybody has dignity concerns, and if we can get coaches to, and with that, my sense is that they already have this in their repertoire, but they may not be labeling it dignity.
Yeah, I'm focusing on that.
Yeah.
Let me back you up just a little bit. If I ask you to give me your definition of dignity, what do you tell me?
It's very simple. So, Joan, the thing is, dignity is all about our deep emotional and spiritual core. All right. So it doesn't really respond that much to analysis. So one of the things that I had to do when I was trying to make up a definition of dignity was to really try to boil it down to its essence, not some fancy analytic, academic.
That would be counterproductive.
No, because dignity is all about our deepest emotional concerns. And so my simple definition is that dignity is our inherent worth and value. And at the same time, the second part of the definition is, yes, we're all born inherently worthy and valuable, but the other half of that equation is that we're also born vulnerable. We're vulnerable to having that dignity violated just as much as we're vulnerable to having a physical injury. And so dignity is very simple. It's our inherent value and vulnerability. And recognizing the piece, everybody can sort of get the fact that we're inherently valuable. And I have one of the slides that I have in my PowerPoint presentation is of this beautiful infant baby. And I say, look, is there any question that this child is born valuable and that it's worthy of our love and attention? But then I say, look at it, it's vulnerable. You could, you drop that kid and but the dignity part is something that we're not quite used to thinking about so clearly as we do physical injuries to our children.
Can you give me sorry, I talked over you. Can you give me an example about how this changed the beginning of an engagement for you? You walk into a conflict resolution or a negotiation situation. What's different now?
Well, what's different is that the conclusion I came to is that we have to have this conversation about dignity before we start trying to do problem solving around the political issues that have to be addressed. So if you don't clear the air and get the emotional dignity violations out of the way, you're not going to be able to get a good, viable, and sustainable resolution to these conflicts. So the way it's changed my work is that is basically all I do right now. I go around, no matter where it is, and say, look, we have to bring these dignity issues to the surface first. We've got to give people an opportunity to talk about the times in which they felt their dignity is violated. And equally important to me, Joan, is to get people talking about ways in which they have violated the dignity of other people. So it's a real balancing act. First of all, you have to help people see the ways in which they're suffering from dignity violations and do a little healing work around that. And then you need to hold up the mirror and say, look, this is what you probably weren't even aware of, but you responded in an undignified way to your own dignity violation. So people get to see the cycle of indignity that gets triggered when someone feels violated. Because what happens, you're so well aware of this, I'm sure, that when somebody's dignity is violated, it's not just he or she who suffers the violation, but the relationship suffers too.
Well, and it spreads out.
And it goes, there's a ripple effect to these dignity violations.
Do you have to backtrack if you have parties that have been in conflict for a long time?
Yeah.
Do you have to dig into past violations between them?
Well, I don't really have to, I ask them to tell me stories. This is what, I was just telling Lou that I think I'm a closet coach because everything has to do with questions for me. So I say to people, okay, tell me a time. What comes to your mind when you hear, the concept of dignity, and how do you feel that your dignity has been affected by this relationship? And that could be in the corporate world, in international conflict, in schools, and it doesn't really matter where I'm asking them. It's universal. And so once I ask that question, they just start talking, and they know, you know. I mean, I use this language of dignity, and that may be new for them. But at the heart of the matter here, Joan, everybody knows this stuff. I'm not saying anything new. I'm just putting a new framing on something that each and every one of us is sensitive to.
Well, you're putting a new frame, I agree with you, but I think you're also calling attention to something that gets pushed aside.
Yeah,
or that
absolutely.
gets undervalued or devalued.
Yeah.
Which is very,
Truly.
very important. So if I am a new coach, let's say, how could I begin to learn to do this in my practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can only say, since I haven't really been involved that much in the world of coaching until recently, but I can just tell you what I normally do.
Absolutely.
I normally go into a conversation, an interview with someone, and I ask them, so let's just say it's in the workplace, for example. I would say, okay, so tell me about what are your highs and your lows here in your job? What do you really love, and what do you wish could be different? And I get them to tell me the story, about both. Because you learn a lot about the highs, too, about ways in which their dignity is being honored when they feel, this is what I love about my job. In there is some recognition of their dignity in that aspect of what they love. But also, I mean, of course, most of the work, as you can imagine, is around ways in which they feel like their identity is they're being discriminated against, or that because of something to do with who they are, they're not being recognized for their unique, contributions. They're not feeling acknowledged. They're not feeling as though they're treated fairly. And so through the stories, all of these ways of being honored and violated come out. And one of the things, I think the biggest, most important, two tools that I've developed is, number one, I have something called the 10 elements of dignity, and 10 ways in which you can have your dignity honored, and certainly the other side of it is dishonored, violated. And so once they tell me the stories about what they're happy with, what they're unhappy with, I hand them this sheet of 10 elements of dignity, and I say, look, take a look at this, because first one is about identity, the second one is recognition, inclusion is another one, acknowledgement, being treated fairly, being understood, being given the benefit of the doubt, and being feeling as though you are autonomous and you have freedom to express who you are in the workplace, and finally that you're apologized to when someone violates you. So I give them these 10 elements, and I say, okay, take a look at these now. Can you see why you feel bad about this aspect of your job? And she would say, or he would say, oh yeah, I'm not being acknowledged. I'm not being seen for what I'm doing, all this great work that I'm doing, or, my boss really violated my dignity. Now that I have this vocabulary, my boss really insulted me, and she never came back and said, I'm sorry. So it's a way of validating what they don't like about their jobs. And in so doing, we can figure out a strategy. How do we move forward with this? How do we work with these dignity violations or these dignity honorings, to create more of that? But how do we also, how do we address the other aspects of it? How do you confront your boss when she or he is violating your dignity? What do you say? There's a whole skill set around that, around giving feedback, about receiving feedback, about standing
Core skills
up.
for coaches, yeah.
Oh yeah. So, but it's all around this issue of dignity.
You said something earlier that really caught my attention, Donna. That was that we also want them and ourselves to look at where we have violated someone else.
Right.
So how does that come up in an engagement?
Well, usually in a failed relationship, I have something else called the 10 temptations to violate dignity. And one of those is, don't assume that you're an innocent victim in a failed relationship. That because we always see ourselves as victims, but usually in a failed relationship there is some kind of reciprocity. It might not be 50-50, it might be 90-10, or in some cases it might not be at all. But I think the default setting that we have based on our self-preservation instincts is to assume that we're the innocent victim. So I'm getting people to switch that default mode and say, look, maybe, is it possible that I contributed in some way to the breakdown of this, and so it's really switching default modes and are more around taking responsibility, doing a lot of reflection about what might I have contributed, what might I have done? And, we all have blind spots.
Yeah, the word that comes up strongly to me is accountability.
Exactly.
And that's what you're teaching.
Yep, accountability and how to take responsibility for when you need to be held accountable. What do you do? It's one thing to say, yeah, I did mess up here and, I did do this. But taking that next step by saying, all right, I've got to go. I've got to go to my colleague, my coworker, my boss, whomever it is, and say, look, I think I've been thinking about what happened to us yesterday, and more I think about it, I realize that I probably contributed some. I probably did X, Y, or Z. And you know what? It is so disarming to hear that. It is such a powerful tool. The more you can acknowledge your role in a failed relationship, because people aren't expecting it. I call it the surprise attack. When I coach people, now I say when I coach people, but when I work with people, I say, I give them the surprise attack. Acknowledge that you might have done something wrong here. And let me just say, and you know what happens? What usually happens is the other person will say, oh, well, yeah, well, that's okay, People are so forgiving. People are, even when they've been violated.
Well, it's the acknowledgement.
It is. And holding yourself accountable.
It's really wonderful work because there's a theory, there's an interventional strategy, and there's a ton of your experience in high-level settings. One of the things that I think many coaches face is that because we're such a young profession, there isn't a lot yet in terms of research and solid. So the more these interventional strategies are used in very important situations, and clearly that's what your work is, I think the more that we bring them into the culture.
Well, that's the other piece of it, Joan. The other piece of it is working on the interpersonal skills of my clients and their direct reports. But it's also looking at how to establish a culture of dignity, a more systemic way of looking at how dignity is handled in the organization. Right? So there's one thing about how you and I interact, but what about the policies that get created? Are those policies ones in which people's dignity is being honored? Or are they policies where people are feeling not seen, not heard, not recognized, not acknowledged? And let me tell you, at this level, working with the leadership teams where I've done interventions, this is the most challenging because they're not used to looking at systemic indignities. They're used to looking at what they do, right? But they're not used to looking at how the organization is either enhancing the group's dignity or compromising it.
Well, you can do the best intervention in the world, but if you don't provide for the sustainability of that intervention, so that cultural piece is the sustainability.
I think so. And can I say one last thing? I don't know if but I didn't say when you asked me about my definition of dignity, it's different from respect. Even though whenever I give talks, I always ask people, well, what comes to mind when you think of the word dignity? They always say respect. It's the first word out of the audience. And I think it's very different, actually. Because dignity, as I played out earlier, I think is part of our birthright. Every single one of us. We don't have to do anything to be worthy of dignity. We're born with it. Imagine that beautiful infant child again. There's no question we'd say that baby is born worthy. But with respect, I think we have to earn it. I think we do have to do something in order to gain respect. When I say I respect someone, I want to feel, gosh, I really admire her, or I want to be like him, right? I want to model my life after this person. But dignity, it levels the playing field. Every one of us deserves it, even people who do bad things, you know. I remember seeing the way Saddam Hussein was pulled out of that foxhole when, you know, or Abu Ghraib, the way even people who are our enemies deserve to be treated as if they're something of value. Otherwise, we just get that cycle of indignity going, and it just goes, you know.
Yeah, I'm struck by the distinction that you draw between dignity and respect. And it would seem to me that, again, in a coaching situation, that distinction is going to be very important because the dignity exists and needs to be honored. The respect needs to be earned. And for a client to see, or an organization to see the difference there, I think would be a very big piece. Good. What do you think is next for you?
Can I say one other thing that I think is important as the difference between dignity and respect? I think the other thing is that one of the things that I went into my research on this topic thinking was that our dignity can be taken away by other people. That other people have the power to you know, really take away our dignity. But the more research I did, and I'd done some work in South Africa, I've done some work with Archbishop Tutu, and know very intimately the work of Nelson Mandela. And what I learned from Nelson Mandela was that no matter how badly he was treated when he was in prison for 27 years, he believes that he survived because of one thing. And that was that he knew that nobody was in charge of his dignity. He was the only person in charge. People could trash his dignity. He was assaulted. His dignity was assaulted, trampled on. He was demeaned in the most heinous ways. But because he knew he was the captain of his own fate, he used this Edward Manley Hopkins poem Invictus to keep him at true north, right? And so that was the one thing. It's almost like Viktor Frankl, you know, he survived the concentration camps because he realized that he had the capacity to make meaning. And so it's very similar. But I can tell you, this is the first thing that I start with, usually also with people, is getting them to recognize that nobody can take away their dignity. But yes, you can have it harmed and injured, and it needs to be healed, just like a physical injury. But there's something about that awareness that dignity is in our own hands, that it really gives people a sense of resilience, like they can bounce back knowing. It's the people who think that they have no dignity, they have no worth, that are the most depressed, the most anxiety prone, and so getting people that recognition, and this isn't easy because if you spent most of your life feeling unworthy, it's pretty hard for a coach to tell you, hey, wait a minute, you know, you are.
Absolutely.
So, but that is a big challenge, but it is the truth with a capital T. Nobody is in charge of our dignity but us.
Good. So just last question, what's next?
Yeah, what's next? Gosh, I don't know. You know, things pop up for me. I'm hoping, well, the next book is going to be Leading for Dignity. And I say for because Dana Bourne, you know, the speaker who was here also today, we had a conversation yesterday because I was going to entitle the book Leading with Dignity as a leadership book. But she said, no, it's really for. She said to me, would you be willing to think about changing the title to Leading for Dignity? Because then you're there as a steward of dignity and as an advocate of dignity. And that takes your work outside of yourself, too.
Fascinating.
Isn't that an amazing distinction she came up with? So now I'm all excited about leading for